when we're out foraging, it's important to pick areas where you're going to get a lot of variety, a lot of opportunity. So what do I mean by that? Well, this field behind me is a really good example. It's not been grazed in quite a while, so that means that any greens that are in this field have had a chance to grow. They haven't been nibbled right back down. It's also got drier raised areas and very wet and boggy areas, so there's good variety within the field. And there's also a river edge along the bottom end of the field. So that's another little microhabitat where we might find some interesting forage species. So this field, I would say, has a lot of opportunity. So let's go and have a look and see what we can find. After a good walk around, I've come to the higher ground of this field. And what I found is not quite what I expected. I was actually looking for winter cress, but instead I found something else equally as good. And it's a great wild food at this time of year, and one that's out a little bit earlier than a lot more of the well-known wild foods which are coming to their own in March and April. Here we've got the hairy bittercress. Now the name hairy bittercress I think is a little bit of an unfair one for this plant, because the words hairy and bitter really do kind of put us off maybe from potentially foraging this. But really it's not that hairy at all. The leaves are sparsely hairy. They're very fine, the hairs on there, so fine in fact we won't pick them up on camera, so you'll have to look for yourself. And also there's that word bitter, but really it's not bitter at all. It's that hot peppery cress taste, just like the stuff you would buy in the shops. And you can use this wild version of cress just like you would use the shop bought variety in sandwiches, in salads, however you'd use it at home. So despite having a bit of an off-putting name, this is a wild food that's well worth knowing about, especially this early in the season. And it's growing in abundance here, it's carpeting the floor, so I feel really good about picking quite a bit for our foraging and our meal tonight. So let's get a closer look at it so we can get to know it better. The first thing to notice about the hairy bittercress, and in fact all bittercresses, is that it grows in a rosette shape, much like you get with something like dandelion or daisy. You can see that there, how all the growth is coming from the centre when I turn it upside down. It's a nice fresh salad green colour, that does stand out, and the leaves themselves are in opposite pairs. They're rounded and with a wavy edge, and there's a terminal leaf at the end. Now, like the ground elder, this is a plant that can often be found in gardens, especially in flower beds that have not been weeded well enough, or pots, and any corner of the garden where a bit of wildness has managed to creep in. And they can be a bit of a bane to gardeners. But as we said, like the ground elder, it's a wild food, so we might as well eat it if we're going to weed it. But unlike the ground elder, this isn't a perennial, it's an annual. And what it will do is, a little bit later in the season, you'll get some seed heads coming up, with flowers as well. It has little tiny white flowers, and the seed heads are upright and narrow and green, looking like little pea pods. And those seed heads, as they mature, will explode and spread more plants in the area. And that's why it spreads around the garden and any place where it can get away. So it keeps coming up throughout the spring. So it's got a long foraging season. We're talking about it now because it's looking good now, and it's a nice early one to find before we're overwhelmed with our nettles, wild garlics and everything else. But you will find this right through March and April and into May as well, and beyond. When we come to harvest the plant, probably the best way to do it is to get some scissors and just get them under the rosette. So you don't want to pull the roots out there, we don't want to uproot the plant. You can cut just below there and just get the whole lot there out in one bunch. There we go. Bit of a few grasses and things tangled in there, but we'll be able to separate that out quite nicely. Nice and neat. Now, I mentioned at the start of this segment that I was a little bit surprised to find the hairy bittercress here. And that's not because you won't find it out in open farmland or in woodland, but in my experience it's mostly been in gardens, as we've talked about, and around edges of villages and urbanised spaces. Often it can grow up out of pavement cracks or on the sides of streets. But of course, if you're foraging in those areas, again, like the ground elder, just be mindful about where you're foraging from and what kind of traffic will have passed through there, who's used the space before you pick the plants, and make sure, of course, you thoroughly wash them. I'm looking forward to using this bittercress later in a sandwich. It's going to go in my cheese sandwich, and I'm going to use the leaves and the stems. It's going to give it some pepperiness and some crunch. A good one to know for February.